Today I'd like to tell you a story. It's a story about American history, but very likely one that you've never heard before. It's a story about how we got here, into the multifaceted crisis facing our nation today. For nearly 50 years, across party lines and with only a few short interruptions, most Americans have said that our country is on the wrong track. A recent study by the Pew Research Center revealed that Americans are broadly pessimistic about our nation's prospects. And the American Psychological Association reports that the future of our nation is a bigger source of stress for average Americans than even their own finances or work. How did we get here? Coming to see our past more clearly equips us to gain mastery over our future. So the tale I'm going to tell you traces the roots of today's problems. Americans had found a balance between rugged individualism and pragmatic communitarianism, Tocqueville observed, a unique blend of cultural values that had built a vibrant, participatory, and by comparison to Europe at that time, surprisingly egalitarian society. But imperfect as it was, democracy in America in the 1830s, Tocqueville felt, was alive and well. As a result, the American dream has been replaced by widespread cynicism about a rigged economic system. This drift toward self-centeredness in private life is matched in the public square. In politics, relentlessly promoting one group's interests at the expense of others has created a repeated failure of compromise in a nation more and more fragmented and more dominated by leaders who prove shrewdest at the game of divide and conquer. Loneliness, isolation, and despair are on the rise as traditional social structures give way. Does democracy in America, they wonder, stand on the verge of ruin? The nation that I have just described is not today's America, but rather a historically accurate portrait of this country in another era, at the opening of the 20th century. The parallels are indeed so striking that the foregoing description could have been given word for word about our nation today. But this realization that we've been here once before begs the question of what happened the last time our nation found itself in such a troubling state of affairs. Clearly, the doomsday prophecies and despairing anxieties of the late 1800s were never fulfilled. In each unique case, culture, society, politics, and economics, the trend line looks like an inverted U. We also steadily wove an ever stronger network of community and family ties, and our culture became more focused on our responsibilities to one another and less focused on our narrower self-interest. America experienced a dramatic, multifaceted, and multi-decade upswing. We were increasingly attentive to our imperfections, especially in racial and gender terms. 20th century America had become demonstrably, indeed measurably, a more we society. In the mid-1960s, the decades-long upswing in our shared economic, political, and cultural life abruptly reversed direction. Between the mid-1960s and today, by scores of hard measures along multiple dimensions, we have been experiencing declining economic equality, the deterioration of compromise in the public square, a fraying social fabric, and a descent into cultural narcissism. Since the 1950s, we have made important progress in expanding individual rights, but we have sharply regressed in our sense of shared responsibilities and community values. Over the past 5 decades, America has become demonstrably, indeed measurably, a more I society. This meta-trend is a phenomenon my co-author and I have come to call the I-we-I curve, a gradual climb into greater interdependence and cooperation, followed by a steep descent into greater independence and egoism, from I to we and back again to I. In other words, looking to the moment when the upswing ended turns out not to be very instructive. Looking to the moment it began proves far more fruitful, especially when the context of that moment bears striking resemblance to the context in which we find ourselves today. But rather that we should take instruction and inspiration from a period of despair, much like our own, on the heels of which Americans successfully and measurably bent history in a more promising direction. But we successfully weathered that storm once, and we can do it again. So what are some of those lessons? How, in another dark moment in our nation's history, did our predecessors manage to turn things around? What led the last upswing was a reinvention of our shared cultural values. What we thought was possible, what we believed was important, and how we saw one another. The huge gap between rich and poor and the political gridlock that accompanied it began to change only after we turned the tide of cultural narcissism. What that means is that in order to successfully solve our economic inequality and political polarization today, we need to start not in the halls of power, not with legislative or programmatic solutions, but instead in the places where our cultural beliefs and values are formed. These are places of the heart, places of connection. This is where we can begin to move once again from a culture of I to a culture of we, a change in our shared values that has the potential to ripple out into every other aspect of our society. This is how we turned our last multifaceted crisis into a multi-decade upswing, and this is how we can reclaim our nation's promise once again. The social gospel called upon people of faith to do the soul-searching and repentant work of recognizing their own complicity in the crises America was facing. The muckrakers told stories that exposed the human cost of America's moral drift and called out the hypocrisy of a nation built upon principles of liberty and equality, producing neither for millions of its most vulnerable citizens. And novelists imagined exciting new futures built upon a moral awakening, reminding Americans that they didn't have to take society's structures and systems for granted. This nation, this bold experiment, could be whatever they chose to make it. But by the 1900s, associations, clubs, societies, federations, and organizations were once again becoming the places that Americans made democracy work. It was this coming together on a human scale that paved the way for a sweeping set of reforms and innovations. No one party, no one policy or platform, and no one charismatic leader was responsible for bringing about America's upswing as we entered the 20th century. It was instead an immense collaboration of countless ordinary Americans, just like you and me. We are the inheritors of the democracy they saved. But we are also the inheritors of an unraveling, a backslide that has landed us right back where they started. And so the choice presents itself again. Will we drift along with the downturn, or will we master the moment and right the ship? So the question is, where do you see yourself in this story? Whatever your gifts and unique passions, there is a place for you on the right side of history.